Hello, this is Melissa Gibson, seminarian at Star King School for the Ministry. This is my final VoiceThread presentation for Intro to Womanist Theoethics. In this VoiceThread, I will explore radical self-love and how it benefits from the mother tree that is womanism. In the forest, a mother tree feeds the seeds of emerging plants, providing nourishment to whatever seeds in plant life come upon it, not just its own direct offspring. So my question going into this research was, what has radical self-love inherited from womanism? Radical self-love is a contemporary movement which has an ever-growing presence and following, particularly on social media platforms such as Instagram and TikTok. For this voice thread, I will specifically introduce viewers and listeners to Sonia Renee Taylor. She is a social media powerhouse, an author, activist, podcaster, and so much more, and I will get to as much of that as I can shortly. Let's get started. So what is radical self-love? Don't confuse it with self-esteem or self-confidence, or even body positivity. Radical self-love, according to Taylor, is its own entity. Much like people have attempted to compare Black feminism and womanism, radical self-love is not a competitor to self-regard or dignity. It is just simply its own thing. As Alice Walker famously said, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. Taylor cites her reasoning for focusing specifically on the body because having a body is, and I quote, a completely non-controversial statement, end quote. Souls, values, and spirits are all up for debate, but bodies, and I quote, yep, we got those. And given this widely agreed upon reality, it seems to me if ever there was a place where the practice of radical love could be a transformative force, the body ought to be that location, end quote. Violence, poverty, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, fatphobia, racism, injustice, those all happen to bodies. So our bodies are the foundation. We can build our body and then go on to do battle about souls and values and spirits. Looking at how we treat ourselves informs us how to treat others, which I think is part of the Anglo-Saxon myth presented in Stand Your Ground by Kelly Brown Douglas. She quotes professor and author Cheryl Harris as saying, "Whiteness and property share a common premise, a conceptual nucleus of a right to exclude," end quote. We have been taught to hate our body if it does not fit into Western beauty standards. We are excluded. They want typically thin, typically white, typically tall, but not too tall, with a quiet elegance and completely able body. We are programmed to beat ourselves up for being too fat, too dark, too loud, and or disabled. So in turn, we pass judgments and assumptions about other bodies that are fatter, darker, louder, and more disabled. Imagine if we just loved ourselves radically. If I love every pound, every texture and hue of my skin, every volume I laugh at, and every part of me, how might I then judge other bodies? As Katie Cannon stated in a 2019 interview with religionandpolitics.org, and I quote, "Black women might emerge and discern just what kind of moral agents we really want to be," end quote. We are called to be the moral agents that we need. Sonia Renee Taylor is certainly not the first person to speak about self-love. I can't fully confirm that she is the first to use the phrase radical self-love, but her current reach is undeniable, and she undoubtedly is bringing the movement of radical self-love into a household near you. I do not think it is a stretch to call her the contemporary parent of radical self-love. Her online community, This Body Is Not an Apology, reaches nearly 1 million people monthly in more than 140 countries. She is on Instagram, Patreon, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, you name it. The second edition of her book, also named This Body Is Not an Apology, has hit the top 10 of every prominent best-selling nonfiction list this year. She was invited to speak to the Obama White House about the intersection of LGBT+ and disability in 2016. Her recognitions and awards are seemingly endless. She also got a bump in fame when, at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, a quote by Taylor went viral on the internet, but was incorrectly credited to best-selling author and shame and vulnerability guru Brene Brown. Brene Brown's team quickly tracked down Taylor and used Brene Brown's massive platform to correct the error and get credit to Taylor. Taylor later appeared for a thoughtful and inspiring interview on Brene Brown's podcast, Unlocking Us. That now rather infamous quote that is still being shared, at least in my circles of the internet, reads, "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature." Later in this voice thread, I will return to this quote to analyze its relevancy to liberation. Layers of wholeness, layers of shame. Womanism hits on the intersections of racism, sexism, and classism, and Gifts of Virtue, Alice Walker and Womanist Ethics by Melanie Harris. Harris examines the work of Alice Walker to create what she calls Alice Walker's 6-step approach to ethical issues. Steps 1 and 2 are uncovering the experiences and stories of Black women and validating them. As Katie Cannon stated in her 2019 interview, and I quote, "Each person's life must be defined, nurtured, and transformed, wherein the self is actualized, affirming the inward authority which arouses meaning and potential with each mystical experience." End quote. We must bring our whole selves, our full existence, every layer to the table. Bringing our whole selves and doing the work to radically love our whole selves results in the shedding of layers of self-hate and shame. Melanie Harris addresses this further in Gifts of Virtue, and I quote, "Self-love was one of the only fully humanizing and spiritually empowering tools strong enough to eradicate the systemic self-hatred fed to Blacks over centuries of physical, emotional, and psychological slavery." End quote. The contemporary movement of radical self-love aims to eradicate that same and expanded system of self-hatred. Gray areas. A theme that came up in this course for me and my classmates several times was the idea of gray spaces, particularly when we analyzed Eureka Badu's The Other Side of the Game. In the song, the narrator's husband is involved in illegal work of some kind. We see him pay off the police, and the narrator bemoans the situation. She loves him. She loves that he does what he can to take care of them and their future child, but she worries about him. We're quick to say that breaking the law is bad, dealing drugs is bad, and this narrator's husband is bad. But if we didn't know his profession, we'd likely say that providing for one's family is good. Not providing for one's family is bad. We see the police officers who, because of their uniforms and status, are assumed to be good by larger society. But if a drug dealer is paying them off, aren't they bad? Maybe even worse? There's a lot of gray in this situation presented in The Other Side of the Game, just as there is a lot of gray in the situation of life. In Womanist Sass and Talkback, Mitzi Smith states, "Binary thinking usually has no basis in reality. To perceive of something or somebody as simply good or evil is to do violence to reality." Similarly, one of Taylor's 3 key tenets toward radical self-love is to make peace with not understanding. Stephanie Meacham states in introducing womanist theology that, and I quote, "Human knowledge is limited, so all theological construction are ongoing projects, and ambiguity is part of the process of womanist theology." End quote. Our life, our faith, our body isn't done yet. To throw labels like good and bad around and not find some peace in the mystery is a disservice to the fullness, the wholeness of our lives, our faiths, and our bodies. Liberation. I quoted earlier Taylor's now famous quote about the pandemic providing us an opportunity to work together to stitch a new garment that fits all humanity and nature. In the 6-step approach to ethical issues that I cited earlier, Melanie Harris offers step 6 as creating sustainable movements towards justice. In my opinion, this is the new garment that Taylor is talking about. This garment is the future we are dreaming. It is liberation of all people. A final word on liberation and radical self-love. This image of Sonia Renee Taylor and her words were just too beautiful to exclude. Liberation is the opportunity for every human, no matter their body, to have unobstructed access to their highest self, for every human to live in radical self-love. And my conclusion. Using the metaphor of the mother tree, womanism has provided a fertile foundation that brings life to the contemporary radical self-love movement. Both womanism and radical self-love recognizes our whole selves, moves us beyond binary thinking, and with a goal of liberation for all. Please note my reference page. I used many of the assigned class readings as well as a few other sources. I would particularly like to draw attention to the art of Bertha Harris, whose work I used on the title slide and the conclusion slide. I know Miss Bertha from Shreveport, Louisiana, and am honored to own 2 originals of her work and her memoir. Miss Bertha grew up in Bossier Parish, Louisiana, where her family worked as tenant farmers. Her story is both a tragedy and a miracle. As an act of self-love, she began to take her painting seriously at age 65 and has grown quite a following. Her work has been featured across the United States, and now, well into her 70s, or maybe 80s, she keeps her age vague, she is still actively painting and sharing her story. Viewers and listeners, thank you for your time and attention. Blessed be.